Hey there, curious minds. Today we're sailing straight into the most famous patch of ocean that doesn't technically exist. The Bermuda Triangle, that terrifying zone where ships vanish, planes disappear, and compasses go crazy, except, what if I told you it's about as dangerous as your bathtub? Plot twist incoming. Here's the thing. The Bermuda Triangle has swallowed exactly 0 ships according to actual statistics. No government recognizes it. It's not on any official map. And yet, it lives rent-free in the heads of millions of people who've never even seen the Atlantic Ocean. This isn't a story about mysterious waters. This is a story about us, about why the human brain is absolutely obsessed with believing the impossible. We're about to dissect one of history's greatest marketing scams disguised as a supernatural mystery. So before we dive in, smash that like button if you're ready to have your childhood fears completely demolished, and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? I genuinely want to know who's joining me on this myth-busting adventure. All right, let's get into it. Let's start with a question that might seem obvious but actually isn't. Why are we, as a species, so absolutely obsessed with places that scare us? Think about it for a second. You've never been to the Bermuda Triangle. Statistically speaking, you probably never will. And yet, somewhere in the back of your mind, there's this little voice that goes, "Yeah, but what if?" whenever someone mentions it. That tiny whisper of irrational dread is fascinating because it tells us something profound about how human brains are wired. We're not just talking about the Bermuda Triangle here. We're talking about a whole category of locations that trigger something primal in us. Haunted houses, ancient burial grounds, that one stretch of highway where people swear they see a ghostly hitchhiker. These places exist in a special mental folder labeled, probably fine, but also, maybe demons. And here's the kicker. Most of us have never personally experienced anything weird at any of these locations. We've inherited our fear secondhand, through stories, movies, documentaries, and that one uncle who swears he saw something unexplainable back in 1987. Unfortunately for Uncle Gary, his story changes every time he tells it, which should probably tell us something. The Bermuda Triangle sits at the absolute peak of this phenomenon. It's the Mount Everest of mysterious locations, the undisputed heavyweight champion of spooky geography. And what makes it special isn't what happens there. It's what we believe happens there. This distinction matters enormously. The triangle has become less of an actual place and more of a concept, a cultural touchstone that we all recognize and respond to emotionally. Say Bermuda Triangle to anyone on the planet, and they immediately conjure images of vanishing ships, lost planes, and possibly alien abductions. That's not geography. That's mythology with really good branding. But why do we fall for it so easily? The answer lies in something psychologists call the need for cognitive closure. Our brains absolutely despise uncertainty. When something happens and we don't know why, it creates this uncomfortable mental itch that demands scratching. And here's where it gets interesting. We'd rather accept a wild, improbable explanation than sit with the discomfort of not knowing. A ship disappeared without a trace? Must be supernatural forces. A plane went down and we never found the wreckage. Clearly interdimensional portals. The real explanation, that the ocean is enormous, deep, and very good at hiding things, feels unsatisfying. It's boring, and boring doesn't scratch the itch. This is why conspiracy theories thrive. This is why ghost stories persist across every culture throughout human history. We're pattern-seeking creatures living in a universe that doesn't always provide neat patterns, so we manufacture them ourselves. The Bermuda Triangle is essentially a massive collaborative fiction project that humanity has been working on for decades. Everyone adds their own details, their own embellishments, their own "I heard that" contributions to the narrative. And because the story is so compelling, nobody really wants to fact-check it. That would ruin the fun, wouldn't it? There's also something deeply appealing about the idea that there are still mysteries left in the world. We live in an age where you can Google literally anything, where satellites have mapped every square inch of the planet, where the unknown feels increasingly rare. The Bermuda Triangle represents a pushback against that. It's a place where, supposedly, the rules don't apply, where technology fails, where nature, or something beyond nature, still has the power to humble us. In a weird way, believing in the triangle is almost nostalgic. It's a longing for a time when the map still had blank spaces labeled, "Here be dragons." Now, speaking of maps, let's talk about something that should probably bother more people than it does. The Bermuda Triangle doesn't exist. I don't mean that in a philosophical way. I mean it literally doesn't appear on any official map anywhere in the world. Go ahead, pull up Google Maps right now. Search for Bermuda Triangle. You'll find Bermuda, sure. Lovely place, great beaches, slightly aggressive customs officers. But the triangle itself? Nowhere to be found. The United States Board on Geographic Names, which is apparently a real thing that exists, does not recognize the Bermuda Triangle as an official region. Neither does any other governmental or maritime authority on the planet. This creates an absolutely hilarious logical problem. We're all terrified of a place that nobody can actually agree on. Ask 10 different sources to draw the Bermuda Triangle on a map, and you'll get 10 different triangles. Some people place the corners at Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. That's the classic configuration. Others stretch it down to include the entire Caribbean. Still others push it out into the mid-Atlantic. The estimated size of this supposedly deadly zone ranges from about 500,000 square miles to over 1,500,000 square miles. That's not a minor disagreement. That's a difference of 1 million square miles, roughly the size of Argentina. We can't even agree on what we're afraid of. Think about how absurd this is for a moment. Imagine if someone told you there was a deadly forest somewhere in North America, but when you asked where exactly, they said, "Oh, it's either in Oregon, or possibly Texas, or maybe it stretches all the way to Manitoba." You'd probably have some follow-up questions. You might even suspect that this person was making things up as they went along. And yet, with the Bermuda Triangle, we just accept this geographic vagueness as part of the mystique. The fact that nobody can pin it down somehow makes it more mysterious, rather than less credible. This vagueness serves an important function for the legend, though. When the boundaries are fuzzy, you can include whatever incidents support your narrative and exclude whatever doesn't fit. Ship sank near the Bahamas? Bermuda Triangle claims another victim. Plane disappeared halfway to the Azores? That's triangle territory, baby. But the cruise ship that safely transported 50,000 passengers through the region last month? Well, that was probably just outside the danger zone. This is called moving the goalposts, and it's a classic technique for keeping a myth alive despite all evidence to the contrary. The lack of official recognition also means there's no standardized data collection for the region. When people say hundreds of ships and planes have vanished in the Bermuda Triangle, they're usually citing numbers that have been passed down through decades of books, articles, and TV specials, each one borrowing from the last without anyone going back to verify the original sources. It's like a game of telephone, except the message started as "some boats sank in the Atlantic" and ended up as "interdimensional vortex devours innocent travelers." The telephone game has never been particularly accurate, and this version is number exception. There's another delicious irony here that's worth appreciating. The very flexibility that makes the Bermuda Triangle impossible to define also makes it impossible to debunk completely. If someone presents statistics showing that, say, the Florida, Bermuda, Puerto Rico triangle has perfectly normal accident rates, believers can simply respond, "Well, that's not the real triangle," and redraw the boundaries to include some other region with higher numbers. The myth is self-defending. It shapeshifts to avoid falsification. That's actually quite clever in a maddening sort of way. What we're dealing with fundamentally is a place that exists primarily in the collective imagination. The water is real. The islands are real. Ships and planes do travel through the region, and yes, some of them have met unfortunate ends over the years. But the triangle, as a coherent, distinct zone with unusual properties, that's a human invention. A story we tell ourselves because stories are how we make sense of a chaotic world. The ocean doesn't care about triangles. The ocean is just doing ocean things, being deep, being wet, occasionally being violent. We're the ones who decided to draw imaginary lines and fill the space with monsters. And honestly, there's something almost touching about that. Humans have been staring at the sea and populating it with terrors since the first person built a boat and realized how small they were compared to the waves. Ancient sailors believed in krakens, sea serpents, and mermaids who would lure you to your doom. Medieval maps literally featured illustrations of monsters in unexplored waters. The Bermuda Triangle is just the modern version of that same impulse, the need to give our fears a shape and a location, to transform the vast, indifferent randomness of nature into something with intention and meaning. The problem is that intentions and meanings are human concepts. The universe operates on physics, not narratives. And when we try to impose narrative structure on random events, we end up seeing patterns that aren't there. We end up believing that a particular patch of ocean has special properties, when in reality, it's just ocean all the way down. This doesn't mean we're stupid. It means we're human. Our brains evolved to find connections because finding connections helped our ancestors survive. It's just that sometimes, the connections we find are completely imaginary. So here we are, millions of people across the globe, united in our belief in a geographic zone that has no official boundaries, no governmental recognition, and, as we'll soon discover, no statistical evidence of unusual danger. We've built an elaborate mythology around what is essentially a random section of the Atlantic Ocean. We've written books about it, made documentaries about it, produced countless hours of content speculating about what might be happening there. And the ocean just keeps doing what oceans do, completely indifferent to our storytelling. There's probably a metaphor in there somewhere about the human condition, but let's not get too philosophical. We've got myths to debunk. The next time someone mentions the Bermuda Triangle with that knowing look in their eye, that "you know what I mean" expression that suggests dark secrets and hidden dangers, remember this. They're talking about a place that literally cannot be located on a map. A zone whose size varies by a factor of 3 depending on who's describing it. A region that no maritime authority, insurance company, or navigation service treats as anything other than ordinary water. The fear is real. The triangle is not. And that distinction is going to become very important as we continue pulling this myth apart, one exaggerated claim at a time. What's remarkable is how resilient this belief has proven to be. You'd think that, in an age of instant information and fact-checking websites, a myth built on such shaky foundations would crumble quickly. But the Bermuda Triangle persists. It adapts. Every time one explanation is debunked, believers simply pivot to another. It's like fighting a hydra made of pseudoscience. Cut off one head, and 2 more conspiracy theories grow back in its place. This resilience tells us something important. The triangle isn't really about facts. It never was. It's about something deeper, something that facts alone can't address. It's about our relationship with the unknown, our fear of powerlessness, and our desperate need to believe that when bad things happen, there's a reason beyond simple bad luck. But here's the beautiful thing about science. It doesn't care about our emotional needs. It just follows the evidence. And the evidence, as we're about to see, tells a very different story than the one we've been sold. A story that's less dramatic, perhaps, but far more interesting in its own way. Because the truth about the Bermuda Triangle isn't that there's nothing happening there. It's that what's happening is completely natural, entirely explainable, and actually quite fascinating once you stop looking for supernatural causes. The real mystery isn't what's taking ships and planes. The real mystery is why we ever believed there was a mystery in the first place. Now that we've established we're all afraid of a place that technically doesn't exist, let's trace this fear back to its origins. And like most European-centered historical narratives, this one starts with Christopher Columbus. Because of course it does. The man gets credit for discovering a continent that already had millions of people living on it. So naturally, he also gets credit for discovering the spookiness of a random patch of ocean. October 1492. Columbus and his crew are sailing through what would later become known as the Bermuda Triangle, and things start getting weird. At least, that's what the legend tells us. Here's what actually happened. Columbus was keeping a detailed ship's log, as any good captain would, and he made some observations that have been wildly misinterpreted for centuries. First, he noticed that his compass was behaving strangely. It wasn't pointing exactly where he expected it to point. Second, he and his crew witnessed a strange light on the horizon, flickering like a candle in the darkness. These 2 entries have been cited by triangle enthusiasts for decades as proof that something supernatural was happening in these waters way back in the 15th century. Columbus himself was spooked, they say. The first European to sail these waters knew something was wrong. Except, well, not quite. Let's break this down with the benefit of modern knowledge that Columbus obviously didn't have. The compass issue? That's called magnetic declination, and it happens everywhere on Earth, not just in the Bermuda Triangle. See, compasses don't actually point to true north. They point to magnetic north, which is a different location entirely. The angle between these 2 norths varies depending on where you are on the planet. Columbus was sailing through a region where magnetic north and true north happened to align more closely than he was used to, which made his compass readings seem off compared to what he expected from European waters. This isn't mysterious. This is basic geophysics. Unfortunately for the legend, Basic geophysics doesn't sell as many books as supernatural forces messing with navigation equipment. And that mysterious light in the distance? The one that flickered like a candle? Columbus was approaching the Bahamas, which, fun fact, were inhabited by the Taino people. People who used fire. For cooking, for warmth, for light. Revolutionary technology, I know. What Columbus almost certainly saw was a torch or campfire on the shore, glimpsed across the water on a dark night. It's also possible he witnessed bioluminescence, which is extremely common in tropical waters and involves tiny organisms lighting up like nature's own rave party. Either way, the explanation is decidedly more science documentary than paranormal investigation. But here's the thing about historical context that we often forget. Columbus and his crew were sailing into what they believed was a completely unknown void. They had no idea how big the Atlantic Ocean was. They didn't know if there was land on the other side, or if they would simply sail off the edge of the world. Okay, they probably didn't actually believe in a flat Earth. That's another myth we've debunked elsewhere. But they definitely didn't know what lay ahead. In that state of mind, every strange occurrence takes on amplified significance. A compass that seems off? Terrifying. A light in the distance when you're supposed to be in the middle of nowhere? Either salvation or something much worse. We have to give Columbus some credit here, though perhaps not the kind he was hoping for. The man was sailing 3 small wooden ships into completely uncharted waters with a crew that was increasingly convinced they were all going to die. Under those circumstances, a little paranoia is not just understandable, it's probably a survival mechanism. The problem is that his anxious observations from 1492 have been extracted from their context and presented as evidence of supernatural phenomena. That's like taking your grandmother's note about hearing a strange noise in her attic and claiming it proves her house is haunted. Grandma was probably just hearing squirrels, and Columbus was probably just seeing basic natural phenomena through the lens of 15th century ignorance. What's particularly amusing is that Columbus made it through the Triangle just fine. Multiple times, actually. He completed 4 voyages to the Americas, crossing this supposedly deadly stretch of ocean on each trip. If the Bermuda Triangle were really swallowing ships left and right, you'd think the most famous navigator of his era might have noticed something more concrete than compass seemed weird and saw a light. The fact that his evidence for the triangle's strangeness amounts to perfectly explainable natural occurrences should probably tell us something. But myths don't care about logic. Myths care about drama. And Columbus encountering strange phenomena in the same waters where ships would later disappear? That's narrative gold, even if it's scientifically worthless. So Columbus planted the first seeds of Bermuda Triangle mythology, albeit completely unintentionally. He was just a guy writing in his diary about confusing experiences, the way any of us might post about a weird day on social media. Compass acting up again, lol. Also saw mysterious lights on the water, probably nothing. #exploration problems. Little did he know that 5 centuries later, people would be analyzing his log entries for clues about interdimensional portals. History is funny that way. Now let's fast forward a few hundred years to when the Triangle really started building its reputation. Because while Columbus may have planted the seeds, it took a series of dramatic incidents, and more importantly, dramatic retellings of those incidents, to turn the Bermuda Triangle into the legend we know today. Welcome to the archive of tragedies, where the line between historical fact and sensationalized fiction gets blurrier than your vision after staring at screens all day. Let's start with a ship called the Ellen Austin, which has become one of the Triangle's most famous stories. According to the legend, in 1881, the Ellen Austin encountered a derelict vessel drifting in the Atlantic with no crew aboard. The captain, being a practical man, decided to send some of his own sailors over to crew the abandoned ship and sail it to port, where both vessels could profit from the salvage. Sounds reasonable so far, but here's where it gets spooky. According to the myth, the 2 ships were separated by a storm, and when they reunited, the salvage crew had vanished. The derelict was once again empty. The captain reportedly tried this twice more, with the same horrifying result each time. Crews sent aboard the ghost ship simply disappeared into thin air. Chilling story, right? Perfect Triangle material. There's just one small problem. It almost certainly never happened. The Ellen Austin was a real ship, that much is true. She was a schooner operating in the late 1800s, and records confirm her existence. But the dramatic tale of the vanishing crews? That appears nowhere in any official maritime records, newspapers from the era, or documented accounts from the time. The earliest versions of this story only started appearing in the 1960s and 70s, conveniently timed with the explosion of Bermuda Triangle literature. Historians who have researched the Ellen Austen have found zero evidence that this incident occurred. The ship made routine voyages without notable incidents. It's as if someone just picked a random 19th century ship name and invented a backstory for it, which, unsurprisingly, is exactly what probably happened. Then there's the USS Cyclops, and this one is actually a genuine mystery, sort of. In March 1918, this massive Navy cargo ship disappeared while traveling from Bahia, Brazil to Baltimore, Maryland. It was carrying over 300 crew members and a full load of manganese ore. The ship never arrived, no distress signal was received, and no wreckage was ever found. For a vessel that size to simply vanish was, and remains, unusual. The Navy conducted an extensive investigation and came up with no definitive answers. This, Triangle believers proclaim, is proof that something sinister lurks in these waters. But let's pump the brakes on the supernatural explanations for a moment. The Cyclops disappeared in March 1918. What else was happening in March 1918? Oh, right. World War I was in full swing, and German submarines were actively hunting Allied shipping in the Atlantic. The Navy's own investigation considered this a likely explanation, though it couldn't be confirmed because, here's the thing about submarines, they don't exactly leave receipts. The Cyclops was also known to have structural problems. She was overloaded with cargo. The weather during her voyage was reportedly rough. Any one of these factors could have contributed to a catastrophic sinking. All of them together? A disaster waiting to happen. The lack of wreckage, while eerie, isn't actually that unusual for deep ocean sinkings. The Atlantic is not shallow. We're talking about depths that would crush a submarine like a soda can. If the Cyclops went down in deep water, as she likely did, the wreckage could be scattered across miles of ocean floor in conditions that make salvage essentially impossible. We didn't find the Titanic until 1985, and that was one of the most famous ships in history. The ocean keeps its secrets, not because of supernatural forces, but because it's really, really big and really, really deep. Sometimes ships sink and we never find them. That's not a mystery, that's just how oceans work. And now we arrive at the crown jewel of Bermuda Triangle incidents, Flight 19, the case that arguably did more to cement the Triangle's reputation than any other single event. December 5, 1945. 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers take off from Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station on a routine training mission. They never come back. A rescue plane sent to find them also vanishes. 6 aircraft, 14 men, gone without a trace. The Navy's official report famously stated that the disappearance was caused by reasons unknown, which is bureaucratic speak for, we have no idea what happened and this is embarrassing. Triangle enthusiasts have been feasting on this story for decades. But here's what actually happened, based on radio transmissions and the investigation that followed. The flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, became disoriented. He believed his compasses had malfunctioned, which, given what we know about magnetic declination in the area, might have simply been normal compass behavior that he misinterpreted. Taylor became convinced they were over the Florida Keys and ordered the flight to head northeast to reach the mainland. The problem? They weren't over the Keys. They were actually over the Bahamas, and heading northeast took them further out over the open Atlantic instead of toward Florida. The radio transmissions from Flight 19 paint a picture not of supernatural interference, but of a tragic navigational error compounded by deteriorating weather and fading daylight. Taylor was an experienced pilot, but experience doesn't make you immune to disorientation. It happens to pilots even today, with all our fancy GPS technology. In 1945, with nothing but compasses and dead reckoning, getting lost over a featureless ocean was terrifyingly easy. The planes likely ran out of fuel somewhere over the Atlantic and went down in waters too deep for the wreckage to ever be found. And the rescue plane that vanished? The PBM Mariner that was sent to search for Flight 19? Those aircraft were nicknamed flying gas tanks because of their tendency to accumulate fuel vapors in the fuselage. A ship in the area reported seeing an explosion in the sky around the time the Mariner would have been searching. The most likely explanation is that something ignited those fuel vapors. A spark, a short circuit, something mundane, and the plane exploded. Tragic, yes. Mysterious? Only if you ignore the well-documented safety issues with that particular aircraft type. What's fascinating about all these cases is how the retelling transforms them. The Cyclops wasn't swallowed by supernatural forces. It was probably sunk by a submarine or structural failure during wartime. Flight 19 wasn't abducted by aliens. It was a navigation error that spiraled into disaster. The Ellen Austen's ghost ship story appears to be entirely fabricated. Yet in the mythology of the Bermuda Triangle, all these incidents become evidence of something beyond explanation. Details get exaggerated. Context gets stripped away. Uncertainty gets repackaged as proof of the paranormal. This is how legends are built, not from whole cloth, but from real events that get distorted through repetition. Each retelling adds a little more drama, removes a little more context, until the original incident is barely recognizable. The human telephone game strikes again, turning "pilots got lost and probably ran out of fuel" into "5 planes vanished without a trace in mysterious circumstances." It's the same story, technically, but one version is tragic, and the other is supernatural. Guess which one makes for better documentary footage? The archive of Bermuda Triangle tragedies is real in the sense that, yes, ships and planes have been lost in this region. But the archive is also deeply misleading, because it presents these losses as unique to the Triangle, when they're actually just part of the normal, sad reality of travel over open ocean. People have been dying at sea since the first person built a boat. The Atlantic doesn't need supernatural forces to be dangerous. It manages that just fine with storms, mechanical failures, human error, and the simple fact that water is not a hospitable environment for air-breathing mammals. Every one of the famous Triangle disappearances has a plausible, natural explanation. We just prefer the spooky version because it makes a better story. So we've established that the famous incidents aren't quite as mysterious as advertised. Ships sink, planes crash. The ocean is big and deep and unforgiving. None of this requires supernatural explanation. But here's the million-dollar question. If the Bermuda Triangle is just regular ocean doing regular ocean things, how did it become the most famous, dangerous location on the planet? The answer, as it turns out, has nothing to do with the sea and everything to do with the power of media to shape reality. Welcome to the story of how journalists, authors, and publishers collectively invented a monster and sold it to the world. The Bermuda Triangle as we know it today was born in February 1964 in the pages of a pulp fiction magazine called Argosy. A writer named Vincent Gaddis published an article titled "The Deadly Bermuda Triangle," and just like that, a legend had a name. Before Gaddis, people had noticed that ships sometimes disappeared in the Atlantic, because, again, that's what ships do sometimes. But nobody had thought to draw a triangle around these incidents and declare them connected. Gaddis did, and in doing so, he created something far more powerful than a geographic region. He created a brand. Think about the genius of that name for a second. The Deadly Bermuda Triangle. It's got everything. Geographic specificity that sounds exotic and far away. A geometric shape that implies precision and boundaries. And that word, deadly, right up front, promising danger and mystery. This wasn't journalism. This was marketing. Gaddis wasn't reporting on a phenomenon that existed. He was packaging scattered incidents into a compelling narrative product, and the public ate it up like it was the last pizza at a party. But Gaddis was just the opening act. The main event came a decade later, when a man named Charles Berlitz published a book simply titled The Bermuda Triangle in 1974. Berlitz was already famous for his language learning programs. Yes, those Berlitz language courses your parents might have tried before giving up on French. Apparently, teaching people to order coffee in Spanish wasn't exciting enough, so Berlitz pivoted to supernatural mysteries. His book compiled every strange story, rumor, and half-baked theory about the Triangle into one breathless volume. And it sold. Oh boy, did it sell. We're talking about 20 million copies worldwide. 20 million. To put that in perspective, that's more than the population of most countries. That's roughly the same as the entire population of Romania deciding they all need to read about mysterious ocean disappearances. The book was translated into dozens of languages and sparked an international obsession that would last for decades. Berlitz had taken Gaddis's concept and supercharged it, turning a pulp magazine article into a global phenomenon. The man deserves some kind of award for marketing, even if the award should probably come with an asterisk noting, "For marketing fiction as fact." Here's what made Berlitz's book so effective, and so problematic. He presented his material with the confidence of a documentary narrator, mixing genuine historical incidents with exaggerated details, unverified claims, and sometimes outright fabrications. He cited sources that were difficult to verify. He omitted information that contradicted his thesis. He took uncertain events and described them with the certainty of an eyewitness. The result was a book that felt authoritative without actually being accurate. It was truthiness before truthiness was even a word. And the timing couldn't have been better. The early 1970s were a golden age for paranormal enthusiasm in America. People were obsessed with UFOs, psychic powers, ancient astronauts, and all manner of unexplained phenomena. Watergate had shattered public trust in institutions, making people more receptive to alternative explanations for, well, everything. Into this cultural moment dropped Berlitz's book, offering a mystery that felt both dangerous and accessible. You didn't need to travel to Egypt to wonder about the pyramids. The Bermuda Triangle was right there in your own hemisphere, swallowing ships practically within sight of Miami Beach. The supernatural had never felt so close to home. But here's where our story takes an interesting turn, because not everyone was buying what Berlitz was selling. A librarian and pilot named Lawrence David Cushy, let's call him Larry because we're friends now, looked at the Bermuda Triangle phenomenon and had a radical thought. What if someone actually fact-checked this stuff? Revolutionary concept, I know. In an age before Google, Larry Cush did something almost nobody else had bothered to do. He went back to the original sources. He dug through newspaper archives, Coast Guard records, weather reports, and official incident investigations. He contacted witnesses and experts. He did actual journalism, which apparently was a novel approach to the Bermuda Triangle. What Cush found was, to put it mildly, embarrassing for the triangle enthusiasts. Case after case, he discovered that the mysterious circumstances had been exaggerated, misrepresented, or completely invented. Ships that supposedly vanished without a trace? Many of them sank during storms that Berlitz conveniently failed to mention. Planes that disappeared in calm conditions? Often the weather was actually terrible, according to official records. Incidents attributed to the Bermuda Triangle? Some of them didn't even occur anywhere near the region. Cush documented all of this in his 1975 book, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, Solved, which is possibly the most satisfying book title ever written for a debunking. One of Cush's most devastating findings was how the mythology had grown through what we might call citational telephone. Writer A would make a claim based on vague or misremembered information. Writer B would cite Writer A as a source. Writer C would cite Writer B. By the time you got to Writer Z, the original claim had been repeated so many times that it had acquired the patina of established fact, even though nobody had ever verified it. The Bermuda Triangle literature was essentially a massive echo chamber, with authors citing each other in an endless loop of unverified assertions. It was peer review, except without the peer part, or the review part. Naturally, Cush's book sold far fewer copies than Berlitz's, because of course it did. Actually, there's a reasonable explanation for everything, doesn't make for a sexy headline. Nobody wants to read a book that tells them their favorite mystery is just a combination of bad weather, human error, and sloppy journalism. We want the aliens. We want the interdimensional portals. We want the ancient Atlantean technology. Cushy was offering vegetables when everyone wanted dessert, and the market responded accordingly. The myth proved more commercially viable than the truth, a pattern that unfortunately continues to this day in many areas of public discourse. But Cush's work did have an impact, at least among people who cared about facts. Scientists, skeptics, and serious researchers began citing his findings. The Bermuda Triangle gradually lost credibility in academic circles, even as it maintained its grip on popular culture. This created a fascinating split. The people who studied the ocean for a living knew the triangle was nonsense, while the general public continued to believe in its deadly mysteries. It was like there were two parallel realities, one based on evidence and one based on entertainment. Guess which one made better TV specials? The media machine that created the Bermuda Triangle never really stopped running. Decades after Berlitz's book, documentaries continue to air on cable channels, breathlessly exploring the mystery, as if Cush's debunking never happened. YouTube is full of videos presenting the same old stories with spooky music and dramatic narration. The triangle has become self-perpetuating content. Each generation discovers it anew and produces fresh media about it, often recycling the exact same discredited claims. It's like a zombie myth that can't be killed because there's always someone willing to resurrect it for clicks and views. This brings us to a deeper question, one that goes beyond the Bermuda Triangle into the territory of how human minds actually work. Why do we keep believing this stuff, even when the evidence clearly points elsewhere? The answer lies in a fascinating set of mental quirks that psychologists call cognitive biases. Our brains, magnificent as they are, have some built-in glitches that make us susceptible to exactly this kind of thinking. Understanding these glitches is like getting the cheat codes for your own mind. Suddenly, a lot of human behavior starts making sense. Let's start with something called apophenia, which is the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. Your brain is a pattern recognition machine. It evolved that way because finding patterns helped our ancestors survive. See rustling in the grass? Might be a predator. Better run. The ancestors who saw patterns everywhere, even when the patterns weren't real, survived more often than the ones who waited around to verify. So now we're all descended from the paranoid ones, and our brains see patterns constantly, whether they exist or not. Applied to the Bermuda Triangle, apophenia works like this. You hear about a ship that sank near Bermuda. Then you hear about a plane that disappeared near Florida. Then another ship. Then another plane. Your pattern-seeking brain connects these dots and concludes that something unusual is happening in that region. But here's what your brain conveniently ignores: the thousands of ships and planes that pass through the same area without incident. The safe passages don't make the news. Nobody writes articles about Flight 447 completes routine journey through Bermuda Triangle. Passengers mildly bored. We only hear about the exceptions, which makes us dramatically overestimate how exceptional they are. This connects to another cognitive bias, called the availability heuristic. We judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. If you can quickly think of several Bermuda Triangle incidents, your brain concludes that such incidents must be common. But the ease with which you recall these events has nothing to do with their actual frequency. It has everything to do with how heavily they've been publicized. The media machine we just discussed has essentially hacked your brain's probability calculator by flooding it with triangle content, while ignoring the vastly larger number of non-events. Then there's confirmation bias, the granddaddy of all cognitive distortions. Once you believe something, your brain actively seeks out information that confirms that belief, while dismissing information that contradicts it. Believe in the Bermuda Triangle? You'll remember every story that supports your belief and forget every statistic that undermines it. You'll notice the documentary about mysterious disappearances and scroll right past the Coast Guard report showing normal accident rates. Your brain isn't trying to find the truth. It's trying to protect your existing worldview, even when that worldview is completely wrong. Confirmation bias also affects how we interpret ambiguous information. Take the compass anomalies that Columbus reported and that continue to feature in triangle mythology. If you already believe the triangle is supernatural, you interpret compass variations as evidence of strange forces at work. If you understand basic geophysics, you recognize magnetic declination as a normal, well-documented phenomenon that affects compasses everywhere on Earth. Same data, completely different conclusions, filtered through different prior beliefs. The facts don't speak for themselves. They speak through the interpreter, and the interpreter has an agenda whether they realize it or not. There's also something called the survivorship bias at play here, though in a morbid twist. We focus on the ships and planes that didn't make it, while ignoring the ones that did. This creates a wildly distorted picture of reality. It's like judging the safety of air travel by only looking at crash reports and ignoring the millions of successful flights. Or evaluating the restaurant industry by only reading health code violation records. You'd conclude that flying is suicidal and eating out is a death wish, when in reality, both are remarkably safe. The Bermuda Triangle's reputation is built on the same flawed methodology, counting the losses while ignoring the vastly more numerous successes. Perhaps the most insidious cognitive trap is the appeal to mystery itself. There's something deeply satisfying about believing in the unexplained. It makes the world feel more interesting, more magical, more full of possibility. Accepting the mundane explanation, that ships sink because oceans are dangerous, is kind of a bummer. Believing in some unknown force that science can't explain? That's exciting. That suggests there are still secrets to uncover, still wonders to discover, still things that go bump in the night. Our brains are wired to prefer the interesting explanation over the accurate one, which is why conspiracy theories and supernatural beliefs persist, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. The Bermuda Triangle, when you really examine it, isn't a maritime phenomenon at all. It's a psychological phenomenon, a mass demonstration of how human cognition can construct elaborate belief systems from almost nothing. The real mystery isn't what's happening in those waters. The real mystery is what's happening in our heads. Why do millions of people believe in something that has no statistical support, no scientific evidence, and no governmental recognition? Because our brains are not designed to evaluate evidence objectively. They're designed to find patterns, confirm beliefs, and prefer interesting stories over boring truths. The Bermuda Triangle exploits all of these tendencies perfectly. Understanding these cognitive biases doesn't necessarily make you immune to them. That's the frustrating part. Even knowing about confirmation bias, you'll still tend to seek out information that confirms your existing views. Even understanding apophenia, you'll still see patterns in random noise. The best we can do is be aware of these tendencies and try to compensate for them through deliberate, critical thinking. Check the sources. Consider alternative explanations. Ask whether the evidence actually supports the conclusion or just feels like it does. It's mental hygiene, essentially, not natural, but necessary if you want to navigate a world full of compelling nonsense. The Bermuda Triangle is actually a perfect case study for developing this kind of critical thinking. It's low stakes enough that examining it doesn't threaten anyone's core identity, but it demonstrates all the same cognitive mechanisms that drive belief in more consequential misinformation. If you can understand why people believe in the triangle, despite the evidence, you're better equipped to understand, and resist, the cognitive traps that lead to believing all kinds of unsupported claims. Consider this chapter not just an explanation of the triangle's appeal, but a vaccination against the kind of thinking that makes such appeals effective. You're welcome. All right, we've spent considerable time discussing cognitive biases, media manipulation, and the psychology of belief. That's all very reasonable and scientifically grounded. But let's be honest. You didn't click on a video about the Bermuda Triangle to hear about confirmation bias. You came for the weird stuff, the aliens, the lost civilizations, the interdimensional wormholes. So let's give the people what they want and take a guided tour through the absolute wildest theories that humans have invented to explain a phenomenon that doesn't actually need explaining. Buckle up, because we're about to leave rationality at the dock. First stop on our paranormal cruise, Atlantis. Yes, that Atlantis. The legendary island civilization that supposedly sank beneath the waves thousands of years ago. According to certain triangle enthusiasts, Atlantis didn't just sink anywhere. It sank specifically in the Bermuda Triangle region, and the remnants of its advanced technology are still down there, messing with ships and planes like some kind of ancient underwater defense system that forgot to turn off. This theory has everything: lost civilizations, mysterious technology, and the implication that we modern humans aren't actually that special because some guys in togas figured out crystal-powered energy weapons before we even invented the wheel. The Atlantis Triangle connection gained serious traction in the 1960s and 70s, partly thanks to the discovery of what became known as the Bimini Road. In 1968, divers off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas found a formation of large, flat limestone rocks arranged in what looked suspiciously like a paved road or wall stretching about half a mile along the ocean floor. Atlantis hunters went absolutely bonkers. This was it, proof that an advanced civilization had once existed in the region. The geometric arrangement of the stones couldn't possibly be natural, they argued. It had to be the work of intelligent beings, probably the same intelligent beings whose technology was now swallowing aircraft. Geologists, unsurprisingly, had a different take. They pointed out that the road was made of beach rock, a type of limestone that forms naturally in tropical coastal areas. The rectangular shapes that looked so artificial? That's just how beach rock fractures, along straight lines, creating geometric patterns. Similar formations exist all over the Caribbean. The Bimini Road wasn't a road at all. It was just rocks doing what rocks do, which is occasionally arrange themselves in ways that excite people who really want to find Atlantis. But try telling that to someone who's already decided they're looking at the ruins of a lost super-civilization. The conversation tends to go poorly. The Atlantis theory gets even more creative when you add the crystal component. Some believers claim that the Atlanteans powered their society using massive crystals that could harness cosmic energy. Essentially, ancient alien batteries made of quartz. When Atlantis sank, these crystals ended up on the ocean floor, where they continue to emit powerful energy fields that interfere with modern technology. Compasses go haywire, radios fail, entire ships get teleported to other dimensions. All because some hypothetical ancients built really good rocks. You have to admire the internal logic, even as you wonder how someone arrived at definitely magic crystals as the most plausible explanation for compass variations. The crystal theory also conveniently explains why we haven't found any actual evidence of Atlantean technology. The crystals, you see, are so powerful that they disintegrate any equipment sent to investigate them. Or they create a cloaking field that makes them invisible to sonar. Or they exist in a slightly different dimension that overlaps with ours only intermittently. The explanations for the lack of evidence are always more creative than the original theory, which is a hallmark of unfalsifiable pseudoscience. When your hypothesis can absorb any contradictory data by inventing new mechanisms on the fly, you're not doing science anymore. You're doing improv. But Atlantis is practically mainstream compared to our next theory, aliens. The extraterrestrial explanation for the Bermuda Triangle has been around almost as long as the triangle myth itself, and it comes in several delicious flavors. There's the aliens are abducting ships and planes for research theory, which imagines Earth as some kind of cosmic safari, where advanced beings occasionally scoop up specimens for study. There's the underwater alien base theory, which suggests that extraterrestrials have established a facility on the ocean floor and are understandably annoyed when human vessels get too close. And there's the alien technology left behind theory, which is basically Atlantis but with more antenna. The alien abduction version is particularly entertaining because of the questions it raises about extraterrestrial priorities. These beings have mastered interstellar travel, crossed unimaginable distances of space, and developed technology that makes our most advanced systems look like stone tools. And what do they want? Apparently, a 1940s torpedo bomber and a cargo ship full of manganese ore. Either aliens have very eclectic collecting habits, or they're specifically interested in mid-century naval equipment for reasons we can't begin to fathom. Maybe there's a museum somewhere in the Andromeda galaxy with a really impressive section on 20th century Earth maritime technology. Who are we to judge? The underwater base theory has the advantage of explaining why we never find wreckage. The aliens are cleaning up after themselves naturally. It also explains the strange lights that people occasionally report seeing in the Triangle region. Those aren't bioluminescent organisms, or boats with navigation lights, or, heaven forbid, the moon reflecting off waves. Those are alien craft, entering and exiting their secret underwater facility. The fact that these lights never do anything demonstrably alien, like violate the laws of physics in a verifiable way, doesn't seem to diminish the theory's popularity. Apparently, aliens who can travel between stars are also very committed to maintaining a low profile, except when they're accidentally sinking ships. Then there's the portal theory, which takes things to a whole new level of creative physics. According to this explanation, the Bermuda Triangle contains some kind of dimensional gateway, a wormhole, a time vortex, a tear in the fabric of space-time itself. Ships and planes that enter this portal don't sink or crash in any conventional sense. They're transported elsewhere. Maybe to another dimension, maybe to another time, maybe to another location in our own universe. The possibilities are literally infinite, which is convenient because infinite possibilities are impossible to disprove. The time travel version of the portal theory offers some truly mind-bending scenarios. What if Flight 19 didn't crash in 1945? What if those planes flew through a temporal anomaly and emerged in, say, 1845 or 2145? The pilots would have no way to communicate their situation. They'd be stranded in a time not their own, eventually running out of fuel and meeting their end in an era that has no record of them. It's tragic and romantic and completely unsupported by anything resembling evidence. But you have to admit it would make a great movie. Someone call Hollywood. Actually, they probably already made this movie, several times. Some portal enthusiasts point to the electronic fog phenomenon as evidence for their theory. A few pilots have reported flying into strange, glowing mist in the Triangle region that seemed to interfere with their instruments and create disorientation. One pilot famously claimed to have flown through such a fog near the Bahamas and arrived at his destination impossibly fast, as if he'd traveled through some kind of shortcut in space. This account has been cited extensively in Triangle literature as proof that something genuinely weird is happening in those skies. Of course, there are some issues with the electronic fog narrative. For one thing, fog is a real meteorological phenomenon that occurs frequently over warm ocean waters, and it can absolutely cause disorientation and instrument confusion without requiring interdimensional portals. For another, the impossibly fast flight might have been the result of favorable winds, inaccurate timekeeping, or simple misremembering. Human perception of time is notoriously unreliable, especially under stressful conditions like flying through unexpected fog. But I flew through regular fog and lost track of time doesn't generate book sales the way I pierced the veil between dimensions does. What all these paranormal theories have in common Atlantis, aliens, portals, is that they're more interesting than the truth. They transform the Bermuda Triangle from a statistically normal patch of ocean into a location of cosmic significance. They suggest that we live in a universe where ancient civilizations, extraterrestrial visitors, and dimensional gateways are all real possibilities. That's an exciting universe to live in. Much more exciting than a universe where ships sink because water is dangerous and planes crash because machines fail. There's also a certain comfort in these theories, paradoxically. If ships disappear because of mysterious forces beyond human understanding, then it's not really anyone's fault. The pilots of Flight 19 weren't lost due to human error. They were taken by something inexplicable. The crew of the Cyclops didn't die because of a structural failure or an enemy submarine. They were transported to another realm. These explanations remove agency and responsibility from the equation, replacing tragedy with mystery. It's easier to accept that your loved one vanished into another dimension than to accept that they drowned because someone made a navigational mistake. The paranormal theories also speak to a deeper dissatisfaction with modern scientific explanations. Science tends to be complicated, technical, and often unsatisfying on an emotional level. The explanation for compass variations involves magnetic field lines and the difference between magnetic north and true north. Accurate, but not exactly thrilling. The explanation for ships sinking in storms involves meteorology and structural engineering. True, but not mysterious. Paranormal theories offer simpler, more dramatic narratives. Ancient crystals, alien technology, holes in reality. These explanations require no technical knowledge to understand, and they deliver the emotional payoff that scientific explanations often lack. It's worth noting that none of these theories have ever produced a single piece of verifiable evidence. No Atlantean artifacts have been recovered from the Triangle. No alien spacecraft have been photographed emerging from the ocean. No portal has been detected by any scientific instrument. The theories exist entirely in the realm of speculation, supported only by anecdotes, misinterpretations, and the burning human desire to believe in something extraordinary. They're not explanations in any meaningful sense. They're stories we tell ourselves, because the true explanation, that the ocean is big and dangerous and sometimes bad things happen, isn't satisfying enough. But here's the thing. I'm not going to tell you that believing in these theories makes you stupid. It doesn't. The human brain didn't evolve to evaluate evidence objectively. It evolved to survive in a world full of danger and uncertainty. And one way it copes with that uncertainty is by creating narratives that make the world feel more comprehensible. Atlantis gives us a story about the rise and fall of civilizations. Aliens give us a story about our place in the cosmos. Portals give us a story about the nature of reality itself. These are deeply human stories, addressing deeply human concerns. The fact that they're almost certainly wrong doesn't make them any less meaningful as windows into what we hope and fear about our universe. That said, there's a difference between finding these theories psychologically interesting and believing they're actually true. Understanding why people believe in Atlantis is valuable. Thinking you found actual evidence for Atlantis because some rocks look sort of rectangular is not. The line between entertainment and epistemology matters, especially in an age where misinformation spreads faster than facts. Enjoy the paranormal theories as creative speculation. Just don't build your worldview on them. The Bermuda Triangle's paranormal mythology is, in many ways, the purest expression of what the triangle represents in our culture. It's not really about the ocean. It's about possibility. The possibility that there's more to reality than what science can measure, that ancient wisdom might surpass modern knowledge, that we're not alone in the universe, that death might not be final but merely a transition to somewhere else. These are profound hopes masquerading as maritime mysteries. The triangle becomes a screen onto which we project our deepest longings and fears, which is why debunking the specific claims never quite kills the appeal. You can explain away every incident, refute every theory, present every statistic, and people will still feel, somewhere in their gut, that something strange is happening out there in those waters. That feeling isn't about evidence. It's about meaning. And meaning is a lot harder to debunk than facts. All right, we've had our fun with alien bases and Atlantean crystals. Now it's time to put on our lab coats, grab our clipboards, and talk about what's actually happening in the Bermuda Triangle, according to people who study oceans and atmospheres for a living. Spoiler alert, it's going to be less exciting than interdimensional portals, but considerably more interesting if you appreciate the genuine complexity of our planet. Science might not offer ancient mysteries, but it offers something better, answers that are actually true. Let's dive in both literally and figuratively. First up, magnetic declination, the phenomenon that's been confusing navigators since Columbus and continues to feature in triangle mythology today. Here's the deal. When you use a compass, the needle doesn't point to the geographic North Pole, the top of the world, where Santa allegedly lives. Instead, it points to the magnetic North Pole, which is a different location entirely. The magnetic North Pole is currently hanging out somewhere in the Canadian Arctic, and it moves around over time because Earth's magnetic field is generated by swirling molten iron in our planet's core, which is not exactly a stable system. The angle between where your compass points and where true north actually lies is called magnetic declination, and it varies depending on where you are on Earth. In most places, this difference is pretty significant. Sailors and pilots have to account for it when navigating. But there are certain lines on Earth, called agonic lines, where magnetic north and true north happen to align perfectly. And guess what runs right through the Bermuda Triangle region? If you guessed an agonic line, congratulations, you've been paying attention. This means that in this area, compasses behave slightly differently than they do in most other places. If you're used to compensating for magnetic declination and suddenly you don't need to, your compass readings might seem off, even though they're actually more accurate than usual. Columbus experienced exactly this. His compass was working fine, he just didn't understand why it was behaving differently than expected. Now, is this magnetic anomaly dangerous? Not really. It's just different, and different can be disorienting if you don't know what's happening. Modern navigation systems account for magnetic declination automatically, so it's essentially a non-issue for anyone with GPS. Even in the pre-GPS era, competent navigators who understood the phenomenon could handle it without trouble. The magnetic declination in the Bermuda Triangle has been thoroughly mapped and documented for decades. There's nothing mysterious about it whatsoever. But compass behaves predictably according to well-understood geophysics, doesn't exactly make for gripping documentary narration, so the myth persists. Let's move on to something considerably more dramatic, the Gulf Stream. This is one of the most powerful ocean currents on the planet, and it flows right through the Bermuda Triangle like a massive underwater river. We're talking about a current that moves approximately 30 million cubic meters of water per second. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 300 times the flow rate of the Amazon River, which is the largest river in the world by volume. The Gulf Stream doesn't mess around. It's essentially a fire hose pointed at Europe, which is why Britain has a milder climate than it probably deserves given how far north it sits. What does this mean for ships and planes in the Triangle? Well, the Gulf Stream can move debris incredibly fast. A piece of wreckage that sinks in the morning could be miles away by afternoon, carried by currents that the average person simply doesn't appreciate. This helps explain why we often don't find remains of vessels lost in the region. They're not being swallowed by supernatural forces. They're being scattered across vast distances by one of the most powerful currents on Earth. Searching for wreckage in the Triangle isn't like searching for your keys in your apartment. It's like searching for your keys in your apartment if your apartment were the size of Texas and everything in it was constantly moving. The Gulf Stream also creates challenging navigational conditions, particularly at its edges, where the current meets calmer water. These boundaries can be surprisingly abrupt, with dramatic changes in water temperature, wave patterns, and vessel handling characteristics over short distances. A ship that's handling fine in calm water can suddenly find itself struggling against powerful currents that weren't on the forecast. Before modern satellite tracking and real-time current data, sailors could easily be caught off guard by the Gulf Stream's strength, not because of anything supernatural, but because the ocean is genuinely complicated and humans are genuinely fallible. Now let's talk about weather, because the Bermuda Triangle sits in one of the most meteorologically active regions on the planet. This area is prime hurricane territory. We're talking about storms that form off the coast of Africa, pick up energy as they cross warm Atlantic waters, and regularly slam into the Caribbean and southeastern United States with devastating force. The Atlantic hurricane season runs from June through November, which means half the year this region is basically a disaster waiting to happen. Ships and planes that operated here before modern weather forecasting were essentially rolling dice every time they set out. But it's not just hurricanes. The Triangle region is also prone to sudden, intense storms that can form with little warning. Warm, moist air rising from the tropical ocean can create powerful thunderstorms in a matter of hours. These aren't your typical afternoon showers. We're talking about systems with violent winds, poor visibility, and the kind of turbulence that can bring down aircraft. Before weather radar and satellite imagery, Pilots and sailors had essentially no warning that these storms were coming. They would fly or sail into clear skies, and hours later find themselves in the middle of conditions that would test even modern equipment. The fact that some of them didn't make it isn't evidence of anything paranormal. It's evidence that nature is powerful, and weather forecasting technology has improved dramatically. There's another weather phenomenon worth mentioning: waterspouts. These are essentially tornadoes that form over water, and they're remarkably common in the warm, humid conditions of the Bermuda Triangle region. A waterspout can appear with little warning, especially in the days before radar, and while most are relatively weak compared to their land-based cousins, they can still cause serious trouble for boats and low-flying aircraft. Imagine you're piloting a small plane in 1940, cruising over what looks like calm ocean, and suddenly a swirling column of water and wind materializes in front of you. That's not a paranormal experience. That's just Tuesday in the tropics. Now let's get to one of the more intriguing scientific theories about the triangle: methane hydrates. This one sounds almost paranormal, which is probably why it's gained so much traction in both scientific and popular discussions. Here's the concept. The ocean floor, in certain areas, including potentially parts of the Bermuda Triangle, contains vast deposits of methane trapped in ice-like structures called hydrates. Under the right conditions, or wrong conditions depending on your perspective, these hydrates can become unstable and release massive amounts of methane gas into the water column. The theory goes like this. A sudden release of methane from the seafloor would create a plume of bubbles rising to the surface. Water filled with gas bubbles is less dense than regular water, which means a ship floating above such a plume would suddenly find itself in a medium that couldn't support its weight. The ship wouldn't sink in the conventional sense. It would drop rapidly, as the water beneath it became something more like a fizzy beverage than a solid support. The ship would go down so fast that there might not be time to send a distress signal, and the bubbles would disperse quickly, leaving no evidence of what happened. It's genuinely spooky, and it's based on real physics. The problem with this theory, at least as applied to the Bermuda Triangle specifically, is that we don't have great evidence for large-scale methane release events in this region. There are methane hydrate deposits in the Atlantic, yes, but whether they've actually destabilized in ways that would affect surface vessels is unclear. Laboratory experiments have shown that bubbles can indeed reduce water density enough to sink ships, so the mechanism is plausible. But plausible isn't the same as documented. No one has ever observed a ship sinking due to a methane eruption, and the conditions required for such an event are quite specific. It's an interesting hypothesis, but it remains unproven for the Bermuda Triangle specifically. What the methane theory does illustrate, though, is that there are plenty of natural mechanisms that could theoretically cause ships to sink without warning. You don't need to invoke supernatural forces when the natural world already has so many ways to kill you. The ocean floor is geologically active, especially in areas with tectonic plate boundaries and underwater volcanic activity. Submarine landslides can generate waves that appear out of nowhere. Rogue waves, massive walls of water that arise from the complex interaction of currents and wind, have been documented by modern ships with the instruments to record them. These waves were dismissed as sailors' tales for centuries, until we finally had the technology to prove they were real. Let's also discuss something that doesn't get enough attention in triangle conversations: the sheer volume of traffic in this region. The Bermuda Triangle encompasses some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, connecting the Americas with Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. Miami is one of the largest cruise ship ports on the planet. Thousands of flights cross this airspace every day. When you have that much traffic, you're statistically guaranteed to have accidents, just like highways with heavy traffic have more crashes than empty country roads. The question isn't whether ships and planes will be lost in the triangle. Of course they will. The question is whether they're lost at higher rates than comparable regions, and as we'll see in the next chapter, they're not. The depth of the ocean in this area also deserves mention. Parts of the Bermuda Triangle sit above the Puerto Rico Trench, which at its deepest point is over 27,000 feet down, more than 5 miles beneath the surface. When something sinks in water that deep, finding it is extraordinarily difficult, even with modern technology. The Titanic sat undiscovered for over 70 years, and that was one of the most famous ships in history, with a relatively well-known sinking location. A cargo vessel that went down somewhere in a 1,000,000 square mile area with depths exceeding 5 miles? Good luck finding that. The mystery isn't that we haven't found the wreckage of some triangle victims. The mystery would be if we had. What all of these scientific explanations share is that they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, the most likely explanation for many triangle incidents is that multiple factors combined. A ship encounters unexpected Gulf Stream currents, then gets hit by a sudden storm, makes a navigational error because of confusing conditions, and goes down in waters so deep that recovery is impossible. No single factor would necessarily be fatal, but together they create a perfect storm, sometimes literally. This is how most disasters actually happen, cascading failures rather than singular causes. It's less narratively satisfying than mysterious forces, but it's how the real world operates. Science doesn't always give us the answers we want. It doesn't provide drama or meaning or the satisfaction of believing in something extraordinary, but it gives us something more valuable: accuracy. The Bermuda Triangle isn't a portal to another dimension or a hunting ground for aliens. It's a complex marine environment with challenging weather, powerful currents, and the same risks that exist anywhere humans venture into nature. Understanding those risks doesn't make them less dangerous, but it does make them manageable. Modern ships and aircraft navigate the triangle safely every single day, by the thousands, because we've learned to work with these natural phenomena instead of inventing supernatural explanations for them. That's not the end of mystery. That's the beginning of wisdom. We've talked about psychology. We've talked about media manipulation. We've talked about science. But now we're going to bring out the heavy artillery, the weapon that myths fear most, the kryptonite of legends, the one thing that doesn't care about your feelings or your favorite theories. We're talking about statistics. Cold, hard, emotionless numbers that simply describe what actually happened, rather than what we imagine happened. If you've been holding on to hope that the Bermuda Triangle is somehow special, this is the chapter where that hope goes to die. Fair warning, this might hurt a little if you were emotionally invested in the mystery, but sometimes the truth is more important than the story. Let's start with a data set that nobody can accuse of bias: Lloyd's of London. For those unfamiliar, Lloyd's is the world's oldest and most prestigious maritime insurance market. They've been insuring ships since the 17th century. If anyone has a financial incentive to know exactly where ships are likely to sink, it's an insurance company that has to pay out when they do. Lloyd's doesn't care about alien theories or crystal pyramids. They care about risk assessment, because risk assessment determines premiums, and premiums determine profits. When Lloyd's analyzes maritime danger, they're not telling stories, they're protecting their bottom line. So what does Lloyd's say about the Bermuda Triangle? Here's the devastating punchline. It's not even close to being among the most dangerous shipping areas in the world. Not top 5, not top 10, not even particularly notable. According to Lloyd's data from 2021, the risk of a maritime incident in the Bermuda Triangle is approximately 90 times lower than the global average. Read that again and let it sink in. 90 times safer than average. The legendary deadly Bermuda Triangle is actually one of the safest stretches of water you could possibly sail through. It's safer than most of the ocean. It's safer than a lot of lakes. You're statistically more likely to have a boating accident on a calm Sunday at your local reservoir than crossing the supposedly treacherous triangle. But wait, it gets better. Or worse, depending on how attached you are to the myth. A comprehensive analysis of approximately 150,000 maritime incidents spanning from 1982 to 2015. That's 33 years of data covering pretty much every significant shipping event on the planet. Found that only about 4% of all global incidents occurred in the Bermuda Triangle region. 4%. That's including the fact that this region contains some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, with massive traffic between North America, Europe, the Caribbean, and South America. Given the volume of vessels passing through, 4% is actually remarkably low. You'd expect more incidents just based on traffic density, and yet the triangle underperforms even that modest expectation. And here's the detail that really puts the final nail in the coffin. Of those incidents that did occur in the Triangle region over those 33 years, not a single one was classified as an unexplained disappearance. 0. None. Every ship that sank had an identifiable cause: weather, mechanical failure, human error, the usual suspects that explain maritime disasters everywhere else on Earth. The mysterious vanishings that define the Triangle mythology simply don't appear in the actual data. Either the aliens got much better at covering their tracks or, and this seems slightly more likely, they were never there in the first place. Let's put this in perspective with some comparison. You want to know where ships actually disappear at alarming rates? The South China Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, the waters around Southeast Asia, the coastal regions of West Africa. These are the places that make maritime insurers nervous. These are the zones where ships run into pirates, political instability, extreme weather, treacherous geography, and all the other factors that actually contribute to maritime disasters. The Bermuda Triangle, by comparison, is practically a swimming pool with lifeguards. It has excellent weather for most of the year, well-maintained port facilities, robust search and rescue infrastructure, and some of the most heavily monitored shipping lanes on the planet. If you were going to pick an ocean region to have an emergency, the Triangle would actually be a pretty good choice. The South China Sea alone accounts for a dramatically higher percentage of global maritime incidents than the Bermuda Triangle, despite being a similar size. The reasons are straightforward: contested territorial waters, high piracy rates, extreme monsoon weather, and dense shipping traffic moving through complex island chains. Nothing supernatural, just geography and geopolitics doing what they've always done. If we applied the same mythological thinking to the South China Sea that we applied to the Bermuda Triangle, we'd have documentaries about ancient dragon emperors sinking ships with mystical weather control. Actually, that sounds pretty entertaining. Someone should pitch that. Here's another way to think about the statistics. The Coast Guard and Navy in the region conduct search and rescue operations regularly, not because an unusual number of people are getting lost, but because the ocean is big and stuff happens. When they do conduct operations, their success rate is comparable to or better than other regions. They're finding people who call for help. They're locating vessels in distress. The rescue infrastructure works the way it's supposed to. None of this would be possible if there were genuinely anomalous forces making ships and planes disappear without warning. The search and rescue teams would be the first to notice if their success rate suddenly dropped in a particular area. They haven't noticed, because there's nothing to notice. Let's also address the "but what about all those ships that disappeared without a trace" argument. Here's the thing. When you actually investigate these claims, most of them evaporate. Some ships that supposedly vanished were later found, just not where people expected. Some were never actually lost at all, and the disappearance story was invented or embellished decades after the fact. Some did sink, but in storms or under circumstances that were thoroughly documented at the time, only to have those details omitted when the story got incorporated into Triangle mythology. Larry Kusch, the librarian turned investigator we mentioned earlier, documented dozens of these cases where the mystery was entirely manufactured. One of my favorite examples involves ships that supposedly disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle, but actually sank hundreds of miles away, in completely different ocean regions. Triangle writers would see a ship that left a Caribbean port and never arrived at its destination, assume it must have disappeared in the Triangle, and add it to the list, without bothering to check weather records, route information, or the actual location of the last known contact. It's like claiming that anyone who vanished between New York and Los Angeles must have disappeared in Kansas, regardless of whether they were actually anywhere near Kansas. The geographic sloppiness would be hilarious if it hadn't contributed to decades of misinformation. Now, the statistics, skeptics might argue that we can only count what we know about, and mysterious disappearances, by definition, leave no evidence to count. This sounds clever until you think about it for more than 2 seconds. If ships and planes were actually vanishing at elevated rates in the Triangle, we would see it in the numbers, even without knowing the specific causes. We'd see more ships departing and fewer arriving. We'd see insurance claims spiking in the region. We'd see shipping companies avoiding the area or charging premiums for Triangle routes. None of this happens because there's nothing unusual happening. The vessels going in are the same vessels coming out, minus the expected statistical noise that affects all maritime travel everywhere. The insurance industry angle is particularly damning for Triangle believers. Insurance companies are in the business of accurately assessing risk because their profits depend on it. If the Bermuda Triangle were actually more dangerous than other shipping areas, insurers would charge higher premiums for vessels operating there. They don't. In fact, they treat the Triangle exactly like any other stretch of Atlantic Ocean because, to the people whose job is to quantify risk, that's exactly what it is. Just another stretch of Atlantic Ocean. These companies have access to data that would make most researchers weep with envy. They employ armies of actuaries whose entire purpose is to detect patterns in loss data, and they have concluded, unanimously and without controversy, that the Bermuda Triangle presents no unusual risk whatsoever. The aviation statistics tell a similar story. The Federal Aviation Administration tracks every aircraft incident in American airspace with almost obsessive detail. Flight paths through the Bermuda Triangle region show accident rates consistent with other comparable areas. Pilots don't report unusual equipment failures or navigation anomalies at elevated rates. Air traffic controllers don't lose contact with planes more frequently than expected. The whole system functions normally, day after day, year after year. The aviation industry moves millions of passengers through Triangle airspace annually without incident. Not without any incidents, accidents happen everywhere, but without any pattern that suggests something unusual is occurring. There's also a selection bias issue that statistics help reveal. The Triangle covers somewhere between 500,000 and 1.5 million square miles of ocean, depending on who's drawing the boundaries. Over the course of a century, in an area that size, stuff is going to happen. Ships will sink, planes will crash. Some of those incidents will be dramatic. Some will involve genuinely mysterious circumstances that are never fully resolved. But that's true of any comparably sized region over a comparable time period. If you drew a triangle of similar size in the Pacific, or the Indian Ocean, or the Mediterranean, and compiled a century of incidents, you'd get a similar list of tragedies and mysteries. The Bermuda Triangle isn't special, it's just famous. Fame attracts attention. Attention generates more stories, and more stories reinforce the fame. It's a feedback loop of mythology that has nothing to do with actual danger levels. The numbers also help explain why the triangle myth persists, despite being demonstrably false. Most people don't interact with maritime statistics. They don't read Lloyd's reports or Coast Guard analyses. What they encounter are stories, dramatic tales of vanishing ships and lost planes, told and retold across generations. Stories are memorable in ways that statistics aren't. You'll remember the 5 bombers of Flight 19 long after you've forgotten that 96% of maritime incidents occur outside the Triangle. That's not a failure of intelligence. That's just how human memory works. We're wired for narrative, not data. The Triangle exploits this wiring perfectly, offering compelling stories while the boring statistics languish unread in insurance industry reports. This is why education matters, and why we're spending an entire chapter on numbers that might seem dry compared to tales of alien abduction. The statistics are the antidote to mythology. They don't care about good stories or emotional satisfaction. They simply report what happened. And what happened is that the Bermuda Triangle, for all its fearsome reputation, is a statistically unremarkable stretch of ocean where ships and planes operate safely every single day. The legend is built on selective storytelling, cognitive biases, and media amplification, not on any underlying reality. The numbers prove this conclusively, for anyone willing to actually look at them. So where does this leave us? With a choice, essentially. You can continue believing in the Bermuda Triangle as a mysterious zone of danger, despite the complete lack of statistical support for that belief. Or you can accept what the data clearly shows, that the Triangle's reputation is a cultural artifact with no basis in maritime reality. Neither choice affects the actual safety of the region. It's going to be boringly safe regardless of what you believe. But one choice aligns with evidence, and one doesn't. In an age of rampant misinformation, choosing evidence over narrative isn't just intellectually honest. It's a kind of civic duty. The Bermuda Triangle might seem like harmless fun, but the thinking patterns that sustain it are the same ones that sustain far more dangerous myths. Learning to follow the data, even when it contradicts a good story, is a skill worth developing. Consider this chapter your practice round. Statistics have thoroughly demolished the idea that the Bermuda Triangle is unusually dangerous. But that raises an obvious question. If the Triangle isn't special, why have ships and planes been lost there at all? What actually causes the tragedies that get transformed into Triangle mythology? The answer is simultaneously boring and terrifying. Boring because it's not supernatural. Terrifying because it reminds us just how powerful nature can be. The real villain of the Bermuda Triangle story isn't aliens or Atlantis or interdimensional portals. It's weather. Good old-fashioned, completely natural, absolutely devastating weather. Let's start with some numbers that put the Triangle's meteorological situation in perspective. Bermuda, one of the 3 points that define the classic triangle, experiences a major destructive cyclone roughly once every 6 to 7 years. That might not sound like much until you realize that's just the big ones, the category-level storms that make international news. Smaller storms, the kind that can still sink boats and down aircraft, are far more frequent. Florida, which forms another corner of the triangle, has been struck by over 500 tropical storms throughout recorded history. That's more tropical storm activity than almost any comparable stretch of coastline on Earth. And Puerto Rico, the third vertex? The island encounters hurricanes 4 to 5 times per year on average. This isn't occasional bad weather. This is a region where atmospheric violence is a regular feature of the calendar. Hurricane season in the Atlantic runs from June through November, which means that for half the year, the Triangle region is essentially a shooting gallery for tropical cyclones. These aren't gentle rainstorms with some wind. We're talking about weather systems that can span hundreds of miles, generate sustained winds over 150 miles per hour, and create waves tall enough to swamp ocean liners. The energy released by a single hurricane equals roughly the explosion of a 10-megaton nuclear bomb every 20 minutes. That's not a metaphor, that's actual physics. And the Bermuda Triangle sits right in the path of these monsters, year after year, century after century. But here's the thing that made the triangle so deadly in earlier eras. People had no warning. Today, we track hurricanes from the moment they form off the African coast. Satellites watch their development. Aircraft fly into them to measure their strength. Computer models predict their paths days in advance. We know when a storm is coming, and ships and planes can simply avoid the area. It wasn't always this way. Before satellite technology, before weather radar, before reliable long-range forecasting, sailors and pilots operated essentially blind. They would set out into weather conditions that looked fine and, hours or days later, find themselves in the middle of a storm that had materialized seemingly from nowhere. Imagine being a sailor in 1920, crossing from Florida to Bermuda in a cargo ship. You check the barometer before you leave. Looks stable. You scan the horizon. Clear skies. Everything suggests a routine voyage. But somewhere out there, invisible to you, a tropical system is developing. You won't know about it until you're in it. By then, it's too late to turn back. Your radio, if you have one, might not reach anyone. Your ship, designed for cargo capacity rather than storm survival, begins to struggle. The waves grow, the wind intensifies, and then you become one of the Triangle's statistics. Not because of anything mysterious, but because you had the terrible luck to be in the wrong place when nature decided to flex. The same principle applies to aviation. Early pilots navigating over the open ocean had limited instruments and no real-time weather data. They relied on forecasts that were, by modern standards, barely educated guesses. A pilot taking off from Fort Lauderdale in 1945 might have received a weather briefing based on observations from ships that had passed through the area hours earlier. Conditions could change dramatically in that time. Suddenly appearing thunderstorms, unexpected headwinds that burned through fuel reserves faster than calculated, fog banks that reduced visibility to zero. All of these could transform a routine flight into a disaster. And over open water, with no landmarks to orient yourself and no nearby airports for emergency landings, the margin for error was essentially non-existent. This brings us back to Flight 19, the case that more than any other defined the Bermuda Triangle's reputation. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth revisiting through the lens of weather and human factors. December 5, 1945. 5 Avenger torpedo bombers depart Fort Lauderdale on a training mission. The weather that day was described as partly cloudy, not obviously threatening, but with conditions that could deteriorate. The flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, was experienced but relatively new to the Florida area. And here's where human factors enter the equation in devastating fashion. The radio transcripts from Flight 19 paint a picture not of supernatural forces, but of a cascading navigational error compounded by deteriorating conditions. Taylor became convinced his compasses had failed. They probably hadn't. He was likely just misinterpreting normal magnetic variation. But his belief that they'd failed led him to distrust his instruments. He thought he was over the Florida Keys when he was actually over the Bahamas. Based on this wrong assumption, he led the flight northeast, which he believed would take them back to the Florida Peninsula. Instead, it took them further out over the open Atlantic. As the afternoon wore on, the weather deteriorated. Visibility dropped. The sun began to set. The planes were running low on fuel. Taylor, increasingly confused and probably aware that something had gone terribly wrong, was heard on the radio trying to figure out his position. The last transmissions suggest the flight was attempting to find land before their fuel ran out. They didn't make it. The most likely scenario is that all 5 planes went down in the Atlantic after exhausting their fuel in conditions that made water landings unsurvivable. No supernatural forces required, just a navigational mistake, bad weather, dwindling fuel, and the unforgiving mathematics of distance over open ocean. The rescue plane that vanished while searching for Flight 19 adds another tragic layer, but again, the explanation is mundane. The PBM Mariner aircraft were notorious for fuel vapor accumulation in their fuselages. Pilots actually called them flying gas tanks. A ship in the area reported seeing an explosion in the sky around the time the Mariner would have been searching. The most probable cause? A spark ignited accumulated fuel vapors, and the plane exploded. A design flaw plus bad luck, not a mysterious force that selectively targets rescue missions. What makes these incidents mythological, rather than simply tragic, is the human tendency to seek extraordinary explanations for emotionally charged events. 5 planes disappearing on a training mission is psychologically unsatisfying if the explanation is, the flight leader got lost and they ran out of gas. We want there to be something more, some hidden cause proportional to the tragedy. Enter the Bermuda Triangle narrative, which transforms a devastating but comprehensible disaster into a cosmic mystery. The myth isn't really about the triangle. It's about our inability to accept that sometimes terrible things happen for ordinary reasons. The human factor in triangle incidents deserves more attention than it usually gets. We tend to imagine ships and planes operated by competent professionals making reasonable decisions, which makes their loss seem more mysterious. But the reality is messier. Fatigue affects judgment. Equipment malfunctions at the worst possible moments. Captains and pilots make mistakes, sometimes fatal ones. Economic pressure leads to departures in marginal conditions. Inexperience combines with overconfidence. None of this is supernatural. It's just the reality of human beings operating complex machinery in dangerous environments. Now, if you're thinking, okay, but surely the Bermuda Triangle is unique in having all these problems, I have some news that might disappoint you. The triangle isn't even close to unique. In fact, mysterious danger zones exist all over the world, each with their own collection of spooky stories and unexplained disappearances. Studying these parallel cases reveals the same pattern playing out across different cultures and geographies. The Bermuda Triangle isn't special. It's just the most famous example of a phenomenon that occurs wherever human imagination meets maritime tragedy. Let's take a tour of the world's other cursed zones, shall we? First stop, the Devil's Sea, also known as the Dragon's Triangle, located off the southeastern coast of Japan. This stretch of Pacific Ocean has its own mythology of vanishing ships and mysterious phenomena, complete with ancient legends about dragons pulling vessels beneath the waves. Japanese sailors have feared this area for centuries, and modern triangle-style writers have been more than happy to connect it to the Bermuda phenomenon. Same pattern: real incidents plus cultural mythology plus modern media amplification equals persistent legend. The Devil's Sea even has its own version of Flight 19, a series of Japanese fishing vessels that reportedly disappeared in the early 1950s, prompting the government to send a research vessel that also vanished. Sounds chilling, right? Except when you actually investigate, the picture becomes considerably less mysterious. The region sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, one of the most volcanically and seismically active zones on the planet. Underwater volcanic eruptions can release gases that reduce water buoyancy. Remember those methane hydrates we discussed? Here, the mechanism is actually documented. Ships in the area have genuinely been endangered by volcanic activity. That's not supernatural, that's just extremely unfortunate geology. Next up, the Michigan Triangle, because apparently even the Great Lakes need their own zone of mystery. This one spans Lake Michigan between Michigan, Wisconsin, and the tip of the Lower Peninsula. Believers point to ship disappearances, strange lights, and even aircraft incidents similar to the Bermuda Triangle's greatest hits. The most famous case involves a Northwest Airlines flight in 1950 that vanished over the lake, never to be found. Spooky stuff, until you remember that the Great Lakes are notoriously dangerous for aviation and shipping. They generate their own weather systems, including lake effect storms that can materialize rapidly. The lakes are deep enough to hide wreckage indefinitely, and heavy shipping traffic means that, statistically, some vessels are going to be lost. The Michigan Triangle is just the Bermuda Triangle applied to fresh water. There's also the zone of silence in the Chihuahuan Desert of Mexico, where radio signals supposedly don't work, and strange phenomena abound. Compasses allegedly spin wildly. Electronic equipment fails. Meteors fall with suspicious frequency. The Mexican government supposedly conducted secret research there. It's all wonderfully creepy, and almost entirely invented or exaggerated. The zone is near a major meteor impact site and a former government rocket testing facility, which provides just enough real-world foundation for the mythology. But scientific investigation has found nothing unusual about radio propagation or electromagnetic conditions in the area. It's just desert. Very hot, very dry, completely ordinary desert. Every one of these zones follows the same formula. You start with a geographic area that has some genuine hazards: volcanic activity, severe weather, deep water, challenging navigation. Incidents occur, as they do everywhere. Some of those incidents resist easy explanation, either because evidence is lost or because investigations are incomplete. Local folklore and cultural narratives provide a framework for interpreting the unexplained. Then modern media discovers the stories, amplifies them, and connects them into a coherent mythology. Suddenly, you have a cursed zone that captures public imagination despite being statistically unremarkable. The Bermuda Triangle didn't become famous because it's actually more dangerous than these other zones. It became famous because it had better marketing. Its location between major population centers meant more traffic and more witnesses. Its proximity to American media markets meant more coverage. Its timing, emerging as a pop culture phenomenon during the 1960s and 70s paranormal craze, gave it cultural momentum that other mystery zones never achieved. The Dragon's Triangle is just as mysterious as the Bermuda Triangle, but it never got a best-selling book in English. Location, location, location. Comparing these zones side by side reveals something important about human psychology. We seem to have a deep need to designate certain places as special, whether specially dangerous or specially sacred. Every culture throughout history has had locations believed to hold unusual power. Mountaintops where gods dwell, forests inhabited by spirits, waters that claim unwary travelers. The modern mystery zones are just updates to this ancient template, dressed in technological language rather than mythological terms. Instead of sea serpents, we get electromagnetic anomalies. Instead of curses, we get interdimensional portals. The specifics change, but the underlying impulse remains constant. Understanding this pattern doesn't necessarily make the triangle less interesting. If anything, it makes it more so. The real mystery isn't what's happening in the ocean. It's what's happening in our minds that makes us so eager to believe in dangerous places despite all evidence to the contrary. The Bermuda Triangle works because it taps into something primal: our fear of the unknown, our need for mystery, our desire to believe that the map still has unexplored edges. These are deeply human impulses, and they'll find expression regardless of what the statistics say. Tomorrow, even after watching this entire video, some part of you will probably still feel a tiny frisson of unease if someone mentions sailing through the triangle. That's not ignorance, that's just what it means to be human. The rational brain knows the truth. The lizard brain still believes in monsters. And honestly, maybe that's okay, as long as we know the difference. So here we are, at the end of our journey through one of the most persistent myths in modern history. We've traveled from Columbus's confused compass readings to Charles Berlitz's best-selling fabrications, from alien abduction theories to insurance actuarial tables, from ancient Atlantean crystals to methane hydrate hypotheses. And what have we found? The Bermuda Triangle is, in the words of one researcher, delightfully unremarkable. Not a portal to another dimension, not a feeding ground for extraterrestrials, not the resting place of ancient super technology. Just ocean. Regular, ordinary, statistically boring ocean that happens to have really good PR. Now I can almost hear some of you thinking, well, that's disappointing. And I get it. There's something deflating about spending an hour learning that a mystery isn't actually mysterious. We came here hoping for secrets, and what we got was weather patterns and cognitive biases. Where's the magic? Where's the wonder? Where's the stuff that makes the universe feel bigger and stranger than our daily commutes? But here's where I'm going to push back, because I think that reaction misses something important. The real story of the Bermuda Triangle isn't disappointing at all. It's actually fascinating, just not in the way we expected. We didn't discover what's lurking in those waters. We discovered something far more interesting. What's lurking in our own minds? The triangle isn't a mystery about the ocean. It's a mystery about us. About how we think, how we believe, how we construct narratives, and how those narratives can take on lives of their own regardless of whether they're true. Think about what we've actually learned. We've learned that a pulp magazine writer in 1964 could coin a phrase and essentially create a geographic entity that would capture global imagination for decades. We've learned that cognitive biases, hardwired into human brains, apophenia, confirmation bias, the availability heuristic, can transform random events into perceived patterns. We've learned that media amplification can turn local tragedies into international mythology. We've learned that humans are so desperate for mystery that will maintain beliefs even when confronted with overwhelming statistical evidence against them. That's not boring. That's a window into the architecture of human consciousness. The Bermuda Triangle is essentially a case study in how myths are born, how they spread, and why they persist. Understanding this process has implications far beyond maritime folklore. The same mechanisms that created the triangle myth are at work in conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, medical misinformation, and political propaganda. The same cognitive vulnerabilities that make us believe in vanishing ships make us susceptible to believing all kinds of things that aren't true. Learning to recognize these patterns isn't just intellectually satisfying, it's a survival skill for navigating the modern information environment. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information and unprecedented vulnerability to misinformation. Anyone with a smartphone can broadcast claims to millions of people. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement tend to promote sensational content over accurate content. The same psychological quirks that made Berlitz's book a bestseller now make viral conspiracy videos spread faster than fact checks can follow. In this environment, the ability to think critically about extraordinary claims isn't optional, it's essential. The Bermuda Triangle might seem like harmless fun, but the thinking habits it represents are anything but harmless when applied to vaccines, elections, or public health crises. Here's the thing about critical thinking that often gets missed. It's not about being a buzzkill. It's not about sucking the wonder out of the world. It's about redirecting your wonder toward things that are actually wonderful. The real ocean is far more amazing than any fictional mystery zone. The Gulf Stream alone, a river of warm water flowing through the Atlantic at unimaginable volumes, is a genuine marvel of planetary dynamics. The bioluminescent organisms that create glowing waves at night are like something from a science fiction movie, except they're real. The complex interactions of atmosphere and ocean that generate hurricanes represent physics operating at scales that dwarf human comprehension. You don't need to invent supernatural forces to find the ocean awe-inspiring. The natural forces are plenty awe-inspiring on their own. The same applies to human stories. The actual tragedy of Flight 19, young men lost due to navigational error and bad luck, their families never knowing exactly what happened, is more emotionally resonant than any alien abduction narrative. The real history of maritime exploration, with all its courage and folly and suffering, doesn't need supernatural embellishment. Adding fictional mysteries to these stories doesn't enhance them, it diminishes them, replacing human drama with cartoon villains and imaginary forces. The truth honors the people who actually lived and died. The myth turns them into props for entertainment. There's also something to be said for the intellectual honesty of accepting uncertainty. One of the reasons paranormal explanations are so appealing is that they provide closure. If Flight 19 was taken by aliens, we know what happened. Weird as it is, it's an answer. If Flight 19 simply got lost and ran out of fuel, we're left with a tragedy that feels incomplete. We don't know exactly where they went down. We don't know their final moments. That uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it's honest. The paranormal explanation trades honest uncertainty for dishonest certainty, and that's not a good trade even if it feels better in the short term. Learning to sit with uncertainty is one of the most valuable skills a person can develop. The world is full of things we don't fully understand, and probably never will. Some mysteries will never be solved, not because they're supernatural, but because evidence gets lost, witnesses die, and the past recedes beyond our ability to reconstruct it. Mature thinking accepts this. It doesn't frantically fill every gap with invented explanations just to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. The Bermuda Triangle teaches us that sometimes we don't know exactly what happened, but it was probably natural causes, is the most honest answer available. And honest answers, even incomplete ones, are better than complete fabrications. I want to address something else before we wrap up. The fear that debunking myths somehow makes the world less magical. This fear is understandable, but ultimately misguided. Magic isn't something we need to protect from inquiry. Real wonder, the kind that sustains curiosity and drives discovery, comes from engaging with the world as it actually is, not as we wish it to be. Every genuine scientific discovery is more magical than any myth, because it's true. The fact that we live on a ball of rock hurtling through space at 67,000 miles per hour, orbiting a nuclear fusion reactor, in a galaxy containing hundreds of billions of stars, which is itself one of trillions of galaxies in an observable universe, that may be infinite, that's not less amazing than crystal pyramids on the ocean floor. It's infinitely more amazing, and it has the added advantage of being real. The Bermuda Triangle, stripped of its mythology, is actually a gateway to genuine wonder. Start asking real questions about the ocean, and you'll find yourself tumbling down rabbit holes of legitimate mystery. How do deep-sea creatures survive pressures that would crush a submarine? How do ocean currents influence global climate patterns? What undiscovered species might be living in the abyssal zones we've barely explored? How did the first life emerge in ancient seas? These questions don't have easy answers, and the search for those answers has occupied brilliant minds for centuries. The ocean doesn't need invented mysteries. It's already the most mysterious environment on our planet, and we've explored less of it than we've explored the surface of the moon. So what's the takeaway from all of this? A few things, I think. First, check your sources. When someone tells you an amazing story, ask where they heard it. Trace claims back to their origins. You might be surprised how often extraordinary claims rest on extraordinarily flimsy foundations. Second, be suspicious of explanations that can't be tested. If a theory explains everything and nothing can disprove it, that's not a strength, that's a red flag. Third, remember that your brain is not a neutral observer. It's a pattern-seeking, story-loving, confirmation-biased machine that will mislead you if you let it. Fourth, don't be afraid of boring explanations. Sometimes the truth is mundane, and that's okay. The universe doesn't owe us excitement. And finally, take pleasure in the process of learning, even when, especially when, it overturns things you used to believe. The Bermuda Triangle. I believed in as a kid was more exciting than the one I understand as an adult. But the journey from belief to understanding was itself exciting. There's genuine joy in figuring things out, in seeing through illusions, in understanding how the world actually works. That joy doesn't require mysteries to be real. It requires a mind willing to question, investigate, and change. If this video has moved you even slightly in that direction, then it's accomplished something more valuable than confirming supernatural beliefs ever could. The Bermuda Triangle will probably never fully die as a myth. 50 years from now, there will still be documentaries presenting the same old stories with spooky music. Still be books claiming to reveal the truth about mysterious disappearances. Still be people on the internet arguing that the statistics are all a cover-up. Myths are resilient because they serve psychological needs that facts can't satisfy. But maybe, for a few viewers, this video will plant a seed of skepticism that grows into something larger. Maybe the next time you encounter an extraordinary claim, you'll pause and ask for evidence. Maybe you'll remember the Bermuda Triangle, how a random patch of ocean became the world's most famous danger zone, despite being statistically safer than most. And you'll think twice before believing the next sensational story that crosses your feed. That's the real treasure we've found in these waters. Not alien artifacts or Atlantean technology, but something more valuable. The tools to think clearly in a world that constantly tempts us to do otherwise. The Bermuda Triangle isn't dangerous, but the kind of thinking that created it? That's genuinely hazardous to your ability to understand reality. Consider yourself vaccinated. If you made it this far, you're clearly someone who values understanding over entertainment, though hopefully you got a bit of both. Hit that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into topics where the truth is stranger and more interesting than the fiction. Drop a comment letting me know what myth you'd like to see examined next. And remember, the most extraordinary thing about our world is that it's real. No embellishment necessary. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.